Hi everyone and welcome. I'm down here in my wormery and this little green tub right here, it's got my African night crawlers in it, or what's left of the African night crawlers that were populating this bin. A week ago I had gone in here and I had extracted worms. And it was the worms that came out of this container that I had used to launch off this container down here. So that container is a week old now, using some of the African night crawlers that had migrated out of this material, but the material was still populated somewhat, so not all of the worms had come out of here yet. The method that I was using to try to get the worms out was a method known as horizontal migration. So you can see there's kind of a dividing line here where there's this side and then there's this side. Over on this side I had been setting up food, and last week it had been 2 weeks that there had been food set up over here to try to bait the worms out of the finished compost. And there were quite a few worms that came together, but when we went rummaging through the remaining material, we did see a fair number of remaining worms. So we went back in here and we reset the food, reset the bedding, and we figured we're just going to give it a little bit more time. So today, a week later, we're going to be checking in here, and right now the only plan I have is to just make sure there's enough food in here to sustain the process to keep the migration moving. But I want to exert a little bit of mental energy to see if I can maybe will, through the power of positive thinking, see if I could somehow maybe hope that within 3 weeks, maybe the worms have actually moved out of these finished castings, and that maybe it's really just down to scooping out their worms and then harvesting these castings, and then that would put this bin at the finish line. But then again, like I said, that might just be wishful thinking. I don't really know exactly what to expect. But to try to reinforce that positive thinking, I've not come down here to the wormery with any food. I'm trying to remain positive, and who knows, maybe this thing is now finished, but we won't know until we get in there. So if they are finished, if they've all moved out, we will scoop them out and we will move them in with their brothers and sisters into the bin where the other ones had gone. And then this will just be a tub of finished castings and we'll be done. But if we find that there are still worms cruising around within this finished castings material, then all we're going to do is add a little bit of food. So it really depends on what we see when we get in here. So why don't we get a little bit closer and see how we're progressing. So now when it comes to horizontal migrations, I never really know what to expect. It is always sort of a crapshoot, but based on the progress we've seen so far, all indications were good that it was going in the right direction and making pretty good progress as of the last time we checked in here. And if the way these worms behaved last time that I moved them out of their previous container and then into this container, in the last container that they were in, they did actually complete their horizontal migration in a fairly short period of time, and they did actually leave the finished compost entirely depopulated. So my hope is that they behave much the same way on this go-around too. So I think the best way to start today's activities is to gauge whether or not there's still any work to be done in here or any more migration activity to expect, or maybe we're going to get lucky and maybe we're just going to find that this material is in fact depopulated by now and just a tub full of finished castings with no worms in it. So why don't we, I guess we'll probe around right over on the very edge of where the food is. Let's see what we see. Right away, I don't see any worms yet. I know that sometimes the camera has a slightly different point of view, slightly different angle. This is so weird. Is this a rock? How could this have been in here all this time and me not find it? Let me see. If I drop it, yeah, it is a rock. All right, so we've pulled out another object from here that doesn't really belong. Could this be another rock? What is going on here? No, this is just a little stem of something, it seems. I'll put that over there. But you know what? These early indications are really good. I wonder if this horizontal migration after only 3 weeks could actually be finished. do another probe right here on the edge and see what we see. Wow, right up to the edge of the paper, and oh, guess what? I spoke too soon. There's a little guy right here, and we'll just help him over onto the feeding area, because I don't know if, one worm is enough reason to keep this migration running, especially if we've just moved them out. This might very well be a tub of finished castings at this point. I mean, if they're not right over here where the plastic had been, where the moisture was recirculating, so this side of the bin was intentionally made to recirculate moisture by being caught on that plastic that was on top, allowing it to condense and drop back down, whereas the paper covering this was really intended to allow moisture to exit the bin a little bit more readily via evaporation. But you know what? Wow. Could it be that the power of positive thinking actually does influence vermicomposting success or failure? I've got a feeling we're done here. That is incredible. Hey Siri, how many days have elapsed since May 23rd?
It was 125 days ago.
Wow. Well, I think that makes it official. This 125-day-old worm bin, after only 3 weeks of attempting to migrate the worms out of the finished compost, is done. How do you like that? That is awesome. I'm actually quite thrilled. This is certainly a life form, but it's not a worm. It's it looks like if I'm not mistaken, it's a centipede. Kind of rolled up in a protective pose, hoping that I don't see him. Or is it a millipede? I think the millipedes are the ones that are okay to keep in there as helpers to your composting process. If it was a centipede, those suckers are blazing fast and they don't just sit there. They try to take off, and they're the ones that actually prey on the baby worms and the worm eggs. And those are the ones that you want to pull out when you see them. But the millipedes are okay, so you don't have to worry. So, wow, okay. Switch gears. I had thought that I'd be running upstairs to the freezer to grab a couple handfuls of food to try to reinforce the feeding zone to keep this horizontal migration going. But there's certainly no need to do that at this point, because these castings have been depopulated. And all we need to do is move the worms over into their new space. But you know what? Now that I come to think of it, that new bin after a week might be actually ready for a feeding also. So maybe I will be feeding African night crawlers today. Just not in the bin that I had thought I'd be feeding them in. Maybe we'll just drop a little bit of fresh food down into there, level things off, and then introduce the remainder of what's in here over into that bin. I guess unless we want to just treat whatever remaining food is still over here as they're feeding, because there wasn't really such a huge remaining worm population in here. And I do believe that I did pretty generously pack that feeding zone a week ago. So maybe there's just enough food left over in there to accompany the worms over to their new place, that we could just treat that as not only a migration of worms, but also a feeding, based on the fact that there's probably still a fair bit of remaining food in here. Very cool. All right, so how do I best accomplish this? I'm wondering if I just place this into a temporary container and save the releasing of these little guys to the very end, so that at the same time we could also gauge whether or not the food that remains in here is adequate, or whether we would want to go grab a little bit more to include with the relocation. So yeah, I'm going to go grab a temporary bin that we could place this feeding zone and worms into, and then we'll move them into their new space. And then I'll have another little batch of vermicompost that I could put into storage. So let me go grab that tray so we can move this material and worms out of here. So I'm going to go ahead and bring this piece of paper back into play over here and just slide it over enough so we've got direct access to the feeding area. The whole idea is that I try not to get this all filthy. That's the only purpose of placing it on top of the paper. And why don't we get down to the business of removing what's in here so we can better gauge what we've got. See how many worms we were able to round up here on the second wave. There's all kinds of bedding material in here too. The bedding material also would definitely count as food. So they'll always turn to the bedding if they either need a little bit of carbon in their diet to balance out the nitrogen-rich foods you're feeding them, or the bedding can just be the material that they hang out in. So it serves both purposes. Though it does seem like we did manage to round up a pretty good number of worms. It's amazing. These worms are just so well behaved. It feels like I had the same exact experience with them the last time I tried moving them from one container to the other. They just, you know, all came over, and in a fairly short period of time. They're just so obedient and well behaved. Or maybe they're just easier to control with positive thinking. Yeah, why don't we go with that? Well, at this point, I think we've probably got our last handful here, maybe. Might have to sweep through with one last cleanup handful. But I believe that the stuff we're seeing scattered in here around the bedding material is mostly castings. I mean, there are some older bits of food that I already noticed here and there as we went along, because a fairly slow composting food item, which is corn cob, was placed in here in a fairly large amount to try to keep the worm migration cooking. So that's what you're going to see most of, I believe, because it does take time for this stuff to break down. I think all the other food that had been placed in here to supplement the existing food that was left over from the previous go-around may have already gone, or may have already been eaten. I don't see any signs of any remaining food other than the corn cob bits. Let me just do one quick sweep through here really quick. Grab a little bit more casting material, a little bit more bedding material to bring over. I guess we can pull this out of here and just do one last sweep through here if we find anything more. But if not, then you know what, that's just castings. We'll leave that behind. I gotta say, I'm really excited. This is awesome. Great results. Much better than I had expected. I was exerting positive thinking, for sure, as you can tell. But in the back of my mind, I just didn't really want to get my hopes up too high either. So I really didn't expect this to be the outcome. But since it is, I gotta say, I'm very pleased. Excellent. So, you know what? This stuff can go with the worms as well. It's all good bedding material. So, I'm going to put these little guys aside. And at some point, harvesting these castings is just going to consist of me dumping this into a storage container. But what we're really interested in doing now is getting the worms released into their new home. So let me go get that other container out here, and we'll get to work on that next. So I shot up to the kitchen really quick, and I grabbed the most recent batch of used coffee that came out of the coffee maker yesterday. And I also went into my freezer and grabbed a couple other things here. These are the peels of a mango, as well as a banana peel in here. There's a couple other small scattered little bits and pieces of things. A chunk of a radish, I think. So I'm going to go ahead and give this to the African night crawlers down here in the Vermibag tote. And at this point, this bin being only 1 week old, or bag being only 1 week old, this will actually be its second feeding, believe it or not, because I always count the feeding that consists of the material that was used to make the bin. So when I make the bin, not only do I put bedding in there, but I also add little bits of food throughout the bin. So the first feeding after a bin's launch, it technically always counts as its second feeding in my record-keeping approach. And what you see over here is all the moisture that collects on that piece of plastic I just removed. So all the material when I built the bin was, you know, moist enough, apparently, to allow for that moisture to try to evaporate and escape the bin. And it's a little bit unusual, because usually when you go right to the top where there's been a lot of moisture recirculating like that, you would hope to see a lot of worms. And I do see one. There's one right there. But I don't see any other worms, which is so weird. Usually it's the top of this soaking wet piece of paper that is covered in worms. But for whatever reason, they're not up here. They're all somewhere down in the bed, I would hope. So why don't we confirm that? I don't see any signs of worms escaping and leaving the bin. So this is definitely not a very deep setup yet. It's still a pretty fresh and new setup. But right away we're seeing worms hanging out. Slightly different behavior than I'm accustomed to seeing with the night crawlers. With the night crawlers, I don't expect to see them jumbled up like that in one particular spot usually. I think what I normally observe with the night crawlers is them kind of being spread out throughout the bin, all sort of occupying their own personal little section of space. I assume they went in search of food, and they must have zeroed in on some of the food that I had used to build the bin, and here's some leftover scraps of it. This is like some yeah, this is cantaloupe rinds, cantaloupe melon. And I would hope to think that we're going to see similar stuff here. So yeah, I guess the worms have pretty much spread out and went in pursuit of all the different chunks of leftover foods that I put in here. This is yet another cantaloupe rind. And you can see that they're still working it, so there's still some food in here. Maybe it was premature for me to grab that pile of fresh food that we're going to be putting in here. But you know what? I'm not too worried. I think they'll do just fine. We're bringing that food over from the old feeding zone too. All those little corn cob bits that we saw a couple examples of in there, as well as a whole bunch of bedding coming with those worms that we're going to be plopping in here. So I think we're going to be safe. I think we could just assume that the bedding that's coming along with the remainder of the worms is going to be enough bedding to complement the food that's in here, along with all this other bedding that's in here too. So why don't we just go ahead and take the food that I bought down here for them and place it in here down the middle of the bin. I don't know, I've always kind of gravitated towards feeding in the middle of the bin. This way I could just go right in there and find the majority of the worms feasting on the food that I'd given them the last go around. So it makes my first peek right into any worm bin that I'm maintaining a pretty dramatic view, because right away there's usually a good number of worms right there where I had last fed. But I do sometimes try other feeding methods, other patterns to feeding. You know, you might see it beneficial to keep moving the feeding zone around and around the bin, keep the worms kind of moving around and, you know, breaking down all the material in the bin in all different sections of the bin. So I might adopt doing that again at some point in the future, but most recently I haven't really bothered too much. Most recently I've always just kind of fed down the middle up until the point where I felt like I was pretty much out of space in the bin. Then I would start feeding on the edge to try to migrate the worms out. So let's see, maybe we could use this as sort of a feeding zone indicator at the end. I had thought about using this piece of coffee filter to show where we last fed, but that cardboard will do just as good. So you can see all the worms that were in this container that we had placed them in to move them over have kind of dropped down into the lower sections of the container to try to get themselves away from the annoying bright overhead lights. You can even see there's some apple over here, some good leftovers for them to eat. So they got leftover food in here, they got fresh food that I just added, and even some leftovers from when the bin was originally built. Kind of makes me think I'm probably good with not feeding this container for a little while. But we'll see. So, who knows when I'll check in on this bin again. Maybe I'll even check in a week's time, but at that point I would have to think that there's still going to be tons of food left in here. So that might just give me a little bit of extra time to wait before I come back in here next time. So I think the only thing remaining is for us to get these little guys into their new home, give them a few minutes to get situated, and then we're done for the day. So let's get this show on the road. Okay, looks like we got everybody out of the bin. This is usually our one chance to try to get a visual confirmation of how many worms we think we migrated. I think my estimate last go around was somewhere in the neighborhood of about 700 or 800 worms. I think I logged it in my spreadsheet as 800 worms being moved over. And this is certainly not as many. But I'll have to say there's at least a couple hundred in here. Possibly more. I mean, do I just stick to trying to log it as a simple round number? Just say this was 200. And then between that and the 800 that I moved last time, I've now got what I estimate to be 1,000 or so African night crawlers. I don't know. That might work. I'd love to hear what you guys think. How many worms do you think I've got in here? Just based on what you saw. I know it's not much, but whatever. Let's give these guys a minute or two to get situated, and then we could cover up and get things cleaned up and put away. You know, I went over there to wash my hands and wash out the clear plastic tray that we used to move the worms in, but I think we've more or less given these guys enough time to retreat down into the material because I don't see any worms. I think I see a little portion of a worm right there, maybe over there, but they're for the most part out of view. So I think we're done here. All right, good job. I'm gonna put things right back the way we found them. We're going to restore this piece of newspaper covering up the entirety of the container. So I usually like to put something between the material in the bin and the plastic that I use to hold moisture down. So otherwise this thing would be covered in castings and it'd be flaking off and making a mess everywhere. And you know what? Oh, I almost forgot. Right here over where we last fed, you know, right down the middle where the fresh food from the freezer went, we're going to mark it using that piece of cardboard. And even though we usually know to look in the middle of the bin to find where we last fed, I like to indicate it, so I put that there. Mostly out of tradition. So, that means this bin can go back up onto the shelf. Right there where it belongs. And the last thing we could do over here is make it official as far as finishing this bin. So let's tear off the start date. And just the presence of the label generally means for me that it's an active bin. And now that it's finished, the label can come off. All right, well that's it. The bin is now finished after 125 days, and all my African night crawlers are over in their new VERMIBAG tote, and they're well fed. They should be good for a couple weeks to go. So, got a little bit more cleaning up and putting things away to do here, but I'm not going to bore you with that. Let me just really quickly say thank you. Thanks for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, please remember to give me a quick thumbs up. That's always really appreciated, and also consider subscribing to the channel too. That's always really appreciated as well. All right, everyone, take care. Have a nice day.